Welcome to the Samurai in Our Closet. What if the most powerful story you learned was the one your family never told you?
Shh! Don't tell anyone, but we have a secret in our family. We have a real samurai sword. My dad says it's hundreds of years old, but I don't know how we got it. And now it lives in our closet.
That was me as a child. And that ancient samurai sword, it stayed hidden in our closet for most of my adult life, along with our family stories as Canadians of Japanese heritage who were interned into remote camps during World War II. But now I'm 60, and sadly, my wonderful father recently passed away, and I can't help wondering if it's time to unlock the mystery of our samurai sword in the closet. My name is Mandy Shintani, and I'm a third-generation Canadian of Japanese heritage, which we refer to as Sansei. This podcast is my journey of uncovering the untold stories of the second generation called Nisei, told through the lens of my father, George Shintani. I asked my older sister, Claire Shintani, if she remembers our sword in the closet.
This is my recollection of the sword. The sword only came out, I probably only saw it maybe 6 times during my time at home. It was not brought out for as a party trick. It was very respectful. It was a very quiet time when it was brought out. And then we would look at the hilt, and it had these beautiful little cherry blossoms that were gold. Do you remember that? No. And there was white bumpy material in between, and Dad said that was shark skin. And I liked that part. And then he would open it, right? And it would be very slow and respectful. I just the moment that the sheath came off, it was so scary. It was so deadly looking. I didn't really enjoy that part. I was glad it was in the closet. It was almost like a ceremony when it was brought out. And it seemed so huge, the sword, didn't it?
Mm-hmm. I didn't know why. I guess I was younger. I didn't know why we had the sword or why it was in the closet. I just remember that we weren't supposed to tell anyone about the sword.
No, it was dangerous. You could tell it was dangerous. Mm-hmm. And it was beautiful, but it was not meant to be on display.
I asked my brother-in-law, Phil Brereton, what do you think Dad thought of the sword?
I think George was afraid of the sword. He thought the sword would bring bad luck to the family. He was worried someone would be hurt by the sword. And so I think it was never his wish that the sword remain in the family. But he also knew how valuable the sword was. And I'm not talking about financial value. I mean, its significance, its importance.
So the sword was to us a thing of beauty, incredible strength, but also scary. And we never lost that fear to talk about it. We didn't have many stories of our parents' history growing up. When I was in high school, our history teacher, while discussing World War II, asked, what group did the Canadian government wrongly intern? I remember the smartest kid in the class put up his hand and he said, Japanese Canadians. I thought, that must not be anyone in our family, because no one had talked about it. Later on, as my father aged, he did start telling us short clips of stories of growing up in Japantown in Vancouver and being interned as a teenager in a ghost mining town. And despite being labeled as an enemy alien at only age 19, he decided to enlist with other Nisei for the Canadian Army. He described his role as translator. Much later, however, we learned that he was training to be a spy, but worked as an interrogator with the Canadian Intelligence Corps, where he received an ancient samurai sword in Singapore while working on one of the most significant war crimes in history, the building of the bridge over the River Kwai by the Japanese Army. I live in North Vancouver, but I've come back to the closet where my story all starts. When I was a kid, we lived in Ontario along with all of our relatives who had to move away from BC during the internment. We lived the middle-class Canadian dream in a small town where we were one of the few families of Japanese heritage. Our house is a white bungalow with blue trim where my parents had built beautiful rock gardens, but then there was the secret in this closet. I'm in my parents' bedroom and the closet has a folding wooden door. I'm gonna open it. It's a typical closet. It's about 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep. My parents hid the samurai sword on this top shelf behind all these boxes and wrapped in a sheet. I'm going to sit in the closet and shut the door. It's dark and cold. This closet represents to me a place in your mind that I believe that we all have, where we have shut ourselves off from asking any questions. Only there comes a day when you can no longer suppress the stories. If I were to open up this closet, it would mean talking and reclaiming the courageous history and culture of the Japanese Canadians that so many of us do not discuss. It was a real honor to also speak with Nisei Mary Kitagawa, who received the Order of BC for activism for Canadians of Japanese heritage. I know you and your husband Tosh are continuing to be activists, and you just explained that because you still find that so many Canadians don't even know about our history.
But you know what, Mandy? There are a lot of Canadians of Japanese descent who don't know our history either. We are known as the silent generation, and a lot of parents and their children never passed on the history of Japanese Canadians and what they went through during the war and what happened after. So in that way, in the silence, I find that maybe there's a fear that if they did keep telling our stories, that we may suffer again.
So you still feel there's an underlying fear?
They feel ashamed of being victimized.
Mm-hmm.
They have this pride of who they are. They don't want to let them know that once upon a time they were victims of this horrible deed that the government had done. I don't know about the future generation because you know that 95% of young people intermarried because it was so painful to be Japanese, of Japanese descent, because then you might be victimized again. Whereas if they start to dilute the Japanese part of their lives, that they might be more acceptable to the wider community.
That's right. At 95%, the third generation, or Sansei, has one of the highest rates of interracial marriage in Canadian history. It wasn't something our parents told us to do, but rather, I believe, a subconscious feeling that it was safer. Like being a banana, yellow on the outside, but white on the inside. We'll examine more of the reasons in the final episode. When I was doing the research, yours was one of the very few stories where it actually talked about the true tragedy and the sadness and the loss and, the fear and the grief. So I appreciate that you were a voice for what truly happened.
Forgiveness is not forgetting. You can't forget your experience, but you could forgive the perpetrator, but you're not really freeing the perpetrator. You are freeing how you feel.
Not forgetting, however, will not be easy, especially as I believe, as Japanese Canadians, we don't do sad very well. And I want to ask Dan Takawa, the author of Vancouver Rashomon, a book about the federal apology and redress, about his experience with remembering the stories. Well, some people would say we shouldn't be talking about these stories because they're making us sad.
I disagree with that because I think it's all part of the healing process. I mean, a big part of the redress movement was recovering the stories and still is recovering the stories. Well, I'm sort of at peace myself, but still, those memories are definitely part of my identity.
Had your father passed on many stories to you? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely not. That's very Japanese Canadian, especially of that age. Shikata ganai, we put it behind us. We don't talk about how hard that was because what good does that do us?
That was Kunji Ikeda, artistic director of Cloudsway Dance and playwright. But it wasn't just about being silent about the stories. According to Steve Nishio, the son of a Nisei veteran who served with my father,
they felt like they had to be really, really Canadian. That generation, almost all of them, not all of them. My Auntie Mitch was an exception. My mom, they just buried their heritage. They dropped everything Japanese, culture and habits, especially language. She refused to eat rice, and her sister refused to eat fish. They just thought that was too Japanese, right? When I was growing up, I never heard her say a word of Japanese. Auntie Mitch, that kind of guided me towards the things that would help me discover my kind of Japanese side and how it would fit in with being Canadian. I was kind of in awe of how she was able to reconcile treatment that she got. Yeah, when I think of it, it makes me so angry and it brings tears to my eyes. She was 12 and thrown in the camps.
here is Stephen reflecting back on his journey to rediscover what had been lost.
I was 16. I barely knew 2 words of Japanese. I can't remember the name of my teacher. It was this older Japanese guy. I don't recall any of the other students being Japanese ancestry. Anyway, he asked the class, so why are you interested in learning to speak Japanese? And, the answers were mostly about, well, travel to Japan, for business or holidays. And when he got to me, I was sort of confounded. I found it hard to articulate. I feel like I have to do this right now. And he was smiling. He just said, third generation tries to remember, but the second generation tried to forget. It was like a light bulb. I was trying to find a lost identity I didn't even know existed.
Here's what Kunji Ikeda found when he looked into his family history in the creation of his play, Sansei the Storyteller.
Yeah, quite a journey, self-discovery, community involvement, the intersections. There's so much. One of the artistic ideas of know thyself. One of my mentors always talked about we need to do our origin stories at some point. And so my play was an opportunity to dig into that, and it seems like there's a similar resonance.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love the way that you describe that.
My hope is that this podcast contributes to you finding your origin story, no matter what your background is, and pride in our story as Canadians of Japanese heritage, to achieve a greater understanding of past generations, our parents, ourselves, and ultimately what we pass on to our children and future generations. I like the way my father's granddaughter, Taylor Carius, explains it. She's using the word ji-chan, meaning grandfather.
No, I think this is just really important for us to make sure we have these conversations now that you're doing this and, we've lost ji-chan and we have grandmother now. I want to make sure that we learn more about these things and that my kids learn about it. And it's not something that's even mainstream, and it didn't happen that long ago. And yet, just like that, history can be entirely erased if we don't keep having these types of conversations.
Before we dive into my father's life, I thought you might want to know what kind of person he was. Here's Graham Watts, my friend and former business partner, describing a story when my father was in his 80s.
Georgia was such a kind soul. The story that comes to mind that is the most vivid for me was we had a home office in the house, and father had come out from Ontario to put down some hardwood floors in your living room. And he would work nonstop through the entire day, laying down the hardwood floors on his own. I was like, George, what's the key to longevity? How do you have a long life? He looked at me and he had a little bit of a glint in his eyes. And he's like, well, Graham, a bowl of rice, a can of beer, preferably Labatt's Blue, and a bowl of ice cream. That is the secret to a long life. And that is the way I remember your dad. Very, very kind, very funny. Yeah, he was.
I love it. And you know, his diet never changed from that.
Well, we could all learn something from that then, because he lived a good long life.
Here's my sister Claire again, who wrote this obituary about our father.
Dad, I hope you can hear this and know it's for you. My father was a man who lived a full life, but spoke modestly about what he had done. It wasn't until much later that I realized Dad had done some pretty amazing things. So let me tell you what he was like as a father. He was interested in the same things we kids were interested in. Things like crawfish under rocks, fossils, the sea, lobsters. He told us 1,000 wise things like, things always look better in the morning. Family is the most important. You don't have to be the most talented or the smartest. Just work hard. When my sisters and I spoke, my father listened as if we were the most fascinating people in the world. He believed, so we believed. To me, my dad seemed fearless. He met 3 prime ministers and tried boogie boarding in Hawaii at 70. Till the day he died, my dad was serene, kind, and gracious. And knowing his belief in ghosts, I thought he would drop by. So today, hoping that he's close by and listening, I'd like to say, thank you, Dad.
My father left us his journal and a recorded interview conducted by the Nikkei National Museum, which I will use to learn the resilient story of the Japanese Canadians during World War II. Their story and how it impacted future generations is as multi-layered as my father's sacred samurai sword. A samurai sword is a highly complex piece of engineering in which the steel of the blade is heated and folded, forming 33,000 layers. Each layer is 100,000 of an inch thick. Similar to the art of making a samurai sword, there are so many layers to uncover in this story. Thank you for listening as I unlock the mystery in this podcast, The Samurai Inner Closet. Join me for 4 episodes while I retrace my father's life. In episode 1, I will visit the neighborhood where my father grew up in historic Japantown in Vancouver before Pearl Harbor. Next, I will travel to a ghost mining town called Sandon, where he was interned as a teenager. In episode 3, my friend Pat Chua visits the infamous Changi prison in Singapore, and we'll find out why my father received an ancient samurai sword from a Japanese prisoner of war. In the final episode, I will explore what are Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei and future generations doing to recover their family history and heritage. Along the way, I will talk to some fascinating authors, playwrights, activists, poets, and historians. For me, though, what will be the most fulfilling and fearful is that for the first time, I will speak with my own family and my own children about our story. Finally, you'll learn where you can view our samurai sword, just as my father would have wanted.
Well, it's a real treasure as far as I'm concerned. If I find a right home for it, I will give it up.
I'm going to give the final word to my father, the most fiercely loyal Canadian I've ever known. Yet, I am now certain that he believed the story of the Japanese Canadians should serve as a cautionary tale in these uncertain times. He wrote in his journal, "Lastly, my story is a tribute to all the Japanese Canadian veterans who enlisted to prove their loyalty to Canada, so that we and future generations may live without fear from the sordid discrimination we had to endure." Thank you for listening. The Samurai in Our Closet was produced by me, Mandy Shintani. The podcast editor was Claude Tanabe, with script editing by Lori Hirata and research by Susan Yatabe. We gratefully acknowledge the support of the Community Fund of the Japanese Canadian Legacies Society and the dedication of our podcast committee members, Tom Boivin, Kim Walker, Phil Burton, Graham Watts, and my sisters Jay and Claire Shintani. Special thanks as well to everyone I interviewed. Your stories made this podcast possible.